What's going on, guys? Welcome back to TheTranq. Today we're going to be doing a quick scrap wood shop organization project. So I've got a lot of sandpaper, sanding blocks, sanding discs, cut-offs, all sorts of things like that don't have a good spot. So I'm going to be making this sanding shelf that I designed to get it all organized and in one spot. I'm going to have these plans available for free. Feel free to download them and build it yourself. Let's go ahead and get started. So the majority of this project is made out of just 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. You could use whatever plywood you want to use, but I like to use the Baltic birch because you've got the more plies than standard plywood, so it's a little bit stronger, a little bit nicer looking. So the first thing I've got to do is start marking out the many dados that go into some of the inner dividers that are going to accept some 1/8-inch plywood panels. And so to do those, I mark them out carefully while it's attached to the vise, and then I just run them through the router table. And what I have in here is an undersized plywood bit, and that just makes easy work of making these dados. Now, the nice thing is that if you do it in one long piece, you can cut them to length later, and then all your grooves or all your dados are going to match up. In this case, they're grooves because it's with the grain. But anyway, it's a really simple project. I'm just going to be using Craig screws to hold it all together, and you'll see this as I go on, but I wasn't even too concerned with if the Craig screws would be visible or not. I just kind of marked them as I needed in order to put this thing together. So again, the majority of this project is really just simple, cut squares, cut rectangles, and just make sure you're being accurate with the dimensions. Now, one thing I'll point out later is that I actually made sort of a major mistake when planning out this project, in that I assumed that the standard size for sandpaper was 8.5 by 11, like a standard piece of paper, but it turns out that sandpaper standard size is 9.5 by 11, and so it's actually got some extra width on it. And so you'll see that the one I made didn't actually perfectly fit, but I'm going to update the plans that I post here so that the ones you guys make will fit standard sandpaper. So there I was just putting in the dados for the 5-inch sanding disc dividers, and now here I'm cutting some side compartments that are going to be making up the divider that I use for the sanding blocks. Now, the idea is that this compartment is going to be able to compile your sandpaper, your sanding blocks, your 5-inch sanding discs, and tear-off sandpaper all into one convenient spot where you can just walk up and do it. Here I was putting the dados into those dividers on the table saw because it wasn't going to be a stable cut to make on the router table. And then here I'm just using a stock block to just cut out several dividers for the 5-inch sanding disc. Now, it'll become more clear as assembly comes around kind of where each of these parts ends up going. And then I'm just cutting out a larger piece that's going to act as the backing for the whole thing. Now here I've got some 1/8-inch pieces cut out, and these are going to be, again, dividers for the actual sandpaper sheets. And first thing I want to do is, there's a couple patterns that go in this project. First one is this diagonal that goes, and it's purely, well, it's actually not just aesthetic, it's also to help you index in finding which sandpaper pieces are which. And so I just 3D printed this template. It was actually 2 pieces that I glued together, and I rough cut it on a jigsaw. And then I just bring it over and flush trim it on the router table. Now the next part is to put a template. It's just basically a small curved profile on the top of the dividers that will be going into those panels that you just saw. And this one really is just aesthetics, but it'll also help with grabbing the pieces of paper out of there. And I didn't do any rough cut since it was only 1/8 inch anyway. It was a pretty easy cut to make on the router table. But you see, you run that through, you get just kind of a nice curved profile on the top of your pieces. So here I'm starting to do a bit of a dry assembly. Now here you can see each of the components more clearly and where they each go. So you can see we've got 8.5 by 11 dividers, 5-inch sanding disc dividers, and block sanders dividers. And then I'm just adding in a few more pocket holes for a couple more of the assembly, a couple more holes before I go into the final assembly. And here I'm using just a couple clamps and the TheTranq clamp, which I actually don't have a ton of success using, but I think I'm just using it wrong, to start screwing things together. It's very modular build. You basically build 3 small compartments and then screw them down to the back panel all at once. And I used I used a thin line of glue and then screws just to make sure it's nice and strong. You could get away easily with just screws. It's really not that important. But here you can see how those curved profiles really make sense now as they drop in. And so you just drop those in, and now you've got sort of a tiered system where you can easily find the different sheets of sandpaper sizes and grits. So now with that sub compartment completed, I just clamp it down onto the back panel and screw it down. And this is where you'll see that this compartment is actually the one that doesn't fit the standard size pieces of sandpaper. So I honestly down the road will probably end up rebuilding this thing. But for now, I built it. I just wanted to get it hung up and get some things off the ground. So I didn't end up changing anything. And it's maybe a little overkill, but I do like to lay out where the pocket hole screws are going to be going. It really, even in your own shop furniture, shop project, whatever you want to call it, it does make all the difference. You can slop something together, or you can kind of nicely put it together. Going back, and if I make this again, I'd make sure to hide the pocket hole screws too, to make it just a little bit cleaner looking. But it is nice to have work that you're proud of within your shop. So I'm just doing a bit of sanding before I start attaching more things. Now this first divider for the 5-inch sanding disc just gets pin nailed into place with a little bit of glue. And then the opposing side, now that those dividers are in, just slides right over. The dados go into those panels, and that can just get glued on and then screwed down. I check to make sure everything's square as I go in, but it's pretty square just by the nature of this assembly. But one thing is, you really do got to clamp it down before you put these pocket hole screws in, because they can easily fidget and bring your pieces out of alignment. So use 1 to 2 clamps before you do it. Again, this one, every time I'm referencing the next subcompartment, I just put some pin nails in there to help keep it in place. That way I don't have to use clamps. So there you can see that's pretty much the end of the assembly. It's really simple, but it's actually, I think it's really well laid out, and you'll see there that it fits these standard 5-roll sanding packs that a bunch of different companies sell, and that makes it another just a really useful feature of this thing. Now, one thing I decide to do, just because I had this piece of Bubinga laying around, is I decided to kind of just cut out some trim and pin nail it on. Again, it's nothing fancy, but adding the trim on actually did just make it look that much a little bit better. And I was glad I ended up just doing this last step. I didn't miter the corners and glue it on carefully, but I just pinned them into place and cut them mostly to rough length, and it did give it just a bit more of a professional look. You can see that if those pocket hole screws were all on the inside, or all in hidden locations, it would actually look pretty good. But here I'm just putting in a couple screws to accept that multi-roll sanding pack, and that's just going to be useful for, again, it's the sandpaper station. Now you can just come tear off the sandpaper you need, and it's really useful. So I hung it up in the shop here just next to a couple of the clamp racks, and it's really just an all-in-one sanding station. So that's it for this build. Alright, that's going to do it for today's video. I'm really happy with how this turned out. It's a really great shop project to help get you organized. You can get all your 5-inch disc sanders, or all your sanding blocks, all your sandpaper, all in one place. You can just come over and grab what you need. It's a super great organization project, and it's super easy to make. I'm going to have free plans in the description where you can build this yourself. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and check out my other videos and subscribe for more projects coming up. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you on the next one.